"Speak plainly, man," commanded the king, his knuckles white as he gripped the carved arms of his oak throne. At 35 years of age, Ethelred had ruled Northumbria for 8 years, defending his realm against Mercian encroachment and Scottish raiders. But never had he faced an enemy like this sea-wolves who struck without warning and vanished like morning mist. "My lord," Oswulf gasped, his voice hoarse from shouting over the wind during his desperate ride, "the Holy Island burns. The Northmen came from the sea like demons, their dragon ships cutting through our waters as if they owned them. Prior Higbald is dead along with dozens of brothers, the treasures of St. Cuthbert gone, every last piece." The court erupted in shocked murmurs, but Ethelred's voice cut through the noise like a blade. "How many ships, how many warriors?" 3 longships, my lord. Perhaps 90 or 100 men in total. They struck at dawn and were gone before the tide turned. Some say they sailed north toward Scotland. Others claim they headed west toward Ireland. Alderman Beanred, the king's chief military advisor, stepped forward with the measured gait of a man who had seen 40 years of warfare. His grey beard bore the scars of Saxon battles, and his counsel had guided Ethelred through many a crisis. "My lord, we must respond swiftly and decisively. If word spreads that our coasts can be raided with impunity, every Viking warband from Norway to Denmark will smell blood in the water." The king rose from his throne, his purple cloak billowing behind him, as he began to pace the length of the great hall. Along the walls hung the shields and banners of his greatest thanes, men who controlled vast estates and could summon hundreds of warriors to the king's service. But what good were land-based armies against enemies who came from the sea? "Send word to Earl Otrad of Bebenberg," Ethelred commanded, his voice carrying the authority of generations of kings. "Tell him to gather every ship he can find, fishing boats, trading vessels, anything that floats. We'll not sit idle while these sea-wolves ravage our shores." Young Prince Alfwald, the king's eldest son and heir, stepped forward with the eager impetuousness of his 22 years. "Father, let me lead the pursuit. Give me 50 mounted warriors, and I'll hunt these Northmen down like the dogs they are." "And how will you pursue ships with horses, my boy?" Alderman Beanred asked gently, his weathered face showing both fondness and concern for the young prince. "The sea is their domain, not ours. We must be clever if we hope to match their cunning." But even as the Northumbrian court debated strategy, the Viking longships were already leagues away, their dragon-carved prows cutting through the swells as they followed. The ancient sea roads, known only to the sons of the northern fjord. Einar Bloodaxe stood at the steering oar of the Raven's Wing, his keen eyes scanning the horizon for Saxon pursuit that would never come. The holds of the 3 longships groaned under the weight of plundered gold. Sacred chalices clinked against silver candlesticks with each rolling wave, while bound monks huddled in the bilges, praying to a god who seemed to have abandoned them to their heathen captors. The great cross of St. Cuthbert, dismantled and packed carefully in wooden chests, would soon grace the hall of some Norwegian jarl, its Christian symbolism transformed into a trophy of Viking supremacy. As recorded in the contemporary writings of Alcuin of York, who corresponded with Charlemagne about the raid's implications for all of Christian Europe, the attack on Lindisfarne represented something unprecedented in its calculated brutality and symbolic significance. It was not merely piracy, but a declaration of war against the entire Christian establishment of northern England. The fire on the horizon had become a beacon, calling every ambitious Viking commander to try their luck against the seemingly defenseless riches of English monasteries. 3 weeks after the sack of Lindisfarne, the smoke-stained longships of Einar Bloodaxe's fleet beached on the rocky shores of where the venerable Bede had once penned his histories in peaceful contemplation. The monastery of St. Paul, twin foundation to St. Peter's at Wyth, stood like a jeweled crown upon the hill, its stone towers gleaming in the afternoon sun, utterly unprepared for the storm that was about to break upon it. Brother Alcar, the monastery's treasurer, had received word of Lindisfarne's fate through traveling merchants, but like many of his brethren, he had convinced himself that such horrors could never be repeated. Surely, he reasoned as he counted the monastery's silver and the safety of the treasury, God would not permit such blasphemy to occur twice. His faith was about to be tested in ways he had never imagined. Einar's force had grown since word of their success had spread through the Viking settlements of the Scottish Isles, and 3 additional longships had joined his fleet commanded by Sigurd the Red, a notorious raider whose name was whispered in fear from the Orkneys to Man, now nearly 150 warriors strong. The Viking army represented the largest foreign invasion of English soil since the coming of the Angles and Saxons themselves. "The Christ god grows careless with his treasures," Sigurd observed as he studied the monastery through the morning mist. A giant of a man with flame-red hair that cascaded over his mail shirt. He wielded a massive 2-handed axe that he called His reputation for brutality exceeded even Einar, and his presence had attracted some of the most feared warriors in the northern seas. But this time, the English were not entirely unprepared. King Ethelred's messengers had ridden hard through the kingdoms of Northumbria, and a small garrison of 20 housecarls had been dispatched to reinforce Jarrow's defenses. These were professional warriors, men who had spent their lives in service to their lord and who would not break and run at the first sight of Viking steel. Sergeant Oldhelm, a grizzled veteran of 30 years' service, had done his best to prepare the monastery for siege. The monks had been trained in the use of spears and shields, though their soft hands and gentle hearts were ill-suited for such harsh work. Barricades had been erected in the main courtyard, and stores of arrows had been distributed among the defenders. "Remember, brother," the sergeant told his mixed force of warriors and monks, as the Viking war cries echoed across the water, "we fight not just for king and country, but for the very soul of Christian England. Let these heathens learn that Saxon steel can bite as deep as any northern blade." The battle for Jarrow began at dawn, but it unfolded differently than the massacre at The Vikings found themselves facing organized resistance for the first time, and their initial assault was bloodily repulsed. 3 of Einar's best warriors fell to Saxon spears before the first barricade, and the sight of their companions' blood seemed to sober the attackers considerably. But Viking warfare was not merely about brute force, it was about adaptability and cunning. While Einar's men maintained pressure on the main gate, Sigurd led a picked force of climbers around to the monastery's seaward wall, where the monks had never imagined an attack had come. Using ropes and iron hooks, the Vikings scaled these supposedly impregnable stone barriers under cover of darkness. The fighting that followed was bitter and desperate. Brother Alcar died defending his treasury, his peaceful hands wrapped around a bloodied sword he barely knew how to use. Sergeant Oldham fell with 7 Viking corpses around him, his final stand buying precious time for a handful of monks to escape into the countryside with word of the attack. As dawn broke over the conquered monastery, Einar surveyed his victory with satisfaction tinged by respect for his Saxon foes. The cost had been higher than had Lindisfarne 13 dead. Vikings aimed twice as many wounded, but the treasure was even greater, and the message to Christian England was clear. Nowhere was safe from the northern thunder. The fire on the horizon was spreading, and the age of easy raids was ending, replaced by something far more dangerous: total war between 2 incompatible ways of life. The autumn of 793 brought King Ethelred's fury to the northern seas, like a tempest unleashed from the depths of Saxon rage. Word of the second monastery raid had reached every corner of Christian Europe, and even Charlemagne himself had sent envoys offering support against the heathen menace. But Ethelred needed no foreign aid to defend his realm. He had something far more valuable: the righteous anger of a people pushed beyond endurance. The royal fleet that assembled at Holy Island consisted of 47 vessels of every description, converted merchant ships bristling with improvised fighting platforms, fishing boats reinforced with iron plates, and even commandeered church barges pressed into military service. At the fleet's heart rode the Northumbrian Lion, the king's own flagship, a massive vessel that had been under construction for 3 years, and was now hurriedly completed with bronze ram and towering stern castle. Earl Uhtred of Bebbanburg stood beside his king on the flagship's deck, his weathered face grim with purpose as he studied the charts spread before them. A sailor since boyhood, Uhtred commanded more respect among the coastal lords than any man save Ethelred himself, and his knowledge of the northern sea roads was encyclopedic. "The Vikings will return, my lord," he stated with absolute certainty, his finger tracing the likely routes on the salt-stained parchment. "Success breeds greed among their kind, and they'll not be able to resist another strike before winter sets in. My guess is Whitby or maybe Tynemouth, both rich prizes and poorly defended." Prince Alfwald, now bearing the honorary title of Admiral of the Fleet despite his youth, leaned eagerly over the charts. The disaster at Jarrow had changed him, burning away the casual arrogance of untested nobility and replacing it with steel-hard determination. "Then we'll be waiting for them, father. Let him come seeking easy Protho, find Saxon wolves instead." The king's strategy was brutally simple: use the monasteries as bait while positioning his fleet to intercept any Viking withdrawal. It was a risky gambit that required precise timing and no small amount of luck. But Ethelred was past caring for caution. The Northman had violated the sanctity of his realm and murdered his people. Now they would face the consequences of awakening the Northumbrian dragon. 300 miles north, Einar Bloodaxe was indeed planning another raid, but the Viking chieftain was no fool. Reports from Irish merchants had reached him of the Saxon fleet's mobilization, and he knew his enemies would not remain passive forever. That knowledge, however, only sharpened his appetite for the coming confrontation. "Let them come," he told his assembled war chiefs as they feasted in the stone hall of a conquered Scottish monarch. "I've sailed these waters since before their king was weaned from his mother's breast. The sea is our domain, not theirs." Sigurd the Red, now Einar's second-in-command and partner in their bloody enterprise, raised his drinking horn in salute. "The Saxon king thinks to trap sea wolves with fishing nets. We'll show him the folly of that thinking." But even as the Vikings made their boasts, fate was preparing a different script. A violent October storm scattered both fleets across the North Sea, driving some ships onto rocky shores, while others struggled simply to survive the mountainous waves. When the weather finally cleared, the carefully laid plans of both sides lay in ruins. It was in this chaos that the two forces finally met, not in the planned ambush off Whitby, but in a chance encounter near the Farne Islands where Einar's reduced fleet of 4 surviving stumbled upon Prince Alfwald's advanced squadron of 8 Saxon vessels. The young prince, commanding from the converted merchant ship St. Cuthbert's Revenge, had no time for elaborate tactics. Seeing the distinctive dragon-carved prows emerging from the morning mist, he ordered an immediate attack, his war horn sounding across the grey waters like the trumpet calls of Judgment Day. "Today we avenge Lynn," he shouted to his crews, and 40 Saxon voices echoed the cry as the two fleets closed for battle. The fire on the horizon was about to become a conflagration that would illuminate the true cost of the Viking Age for both sides. The Battle of Farne Islands erupted with the fury of two storms colliding, as Saxon war cries mingled with Viking battle songs across waters that would soon run red with the blood of warriors. Prince Alfwald's flagship St. Cuthbert's Revenge bore down on Einar's Raven's Wing like a charging bull, her bronze-sheathed ram cutting through the swells, while her crew of 40 battle-hardened housecarls prepared for the killing work ahead. Einar Bloodaxe stood unmoved at his vessel's prow, his double-bladed axe reflecting the pale October sun as he watched the Saxon charge with the calculating eyes of a predator. At 53 years old, he had survived more sea battles than most men could count, and he recognized both the courage and the inexperience in his young opponent's tactics. "Starboard oars, backwater," he commanded his crew in the Norse tongue, and the Raven's Wing suddenly veered aside with the fluid grace of a striking serpent. The Saxon ram missed its mark by mere feet, and as the St. Cuthbert's Revenge swept past, Einar's warriors unleashed a devastating volley of iron-pointed spears that claimed 6 English lives and as many heartbeats. But Prince Alfwald had inherited more than his father's crown. He possessed the quick wit of a born warrior. Even as his flagship continued its charge, he was already shouting orders to bring her about for another pass. "Archers to the fighting platform, boarding parties to the rail. We'll not let these sea-wolves escape us." The battle quickly devolved into a series of individual ship-to-ship combats, as the larger Saxon vessels used their superior numbers to surround and isolate the Viking line. On the northern flank, Sigurd the Red Wolf's Bane found herself trapped between 2 converted merchant ships, their crews raining arrows and javelins down from improvised fighting towers, while grappling hooks sought to bind the vessels together for boarding actions. Sigurd himself led the defense of his ship's rail, his massive 200 axe skull cleaver living up to its name as Saxon warriors tried desperately to gain a foothold on the Viking deck. But the English had learned from their earlier encounters these were no defenseless monks, but professional soldiers who gave as good as they got. The turning point came when young Thorvald, son of Bjorn Ironfist and barely 18 years old, attempted to leap from his father's sinking longship to the safety of Einar's vessel. A Saxon spear took him in mid-flight, and his body vanished beneath the grey waters with barely a splash. The sight of the boy's death seemed to break something in the Viking chief, and for the first time in his long career, Einar Bloodaxe felt the cold touch of defeat. As detailed in the Northumbrian Royal Chronicle, which would later record this engagement as the first naval victory of the Viking Wars, the battle lasted nearly 4 hours and claimed the lives of 67 Vikings and 31 Butcher's bill that shocked both sides with its savage totality. By afternoon, only 2 Viking longships remained afloat, both badly damaged and taking on water. Einar, his left arm hanging useless from a Saxon sword cut, made the hardest decision of his life. Signaled a retreat, he ordered through gritted teeth, "We'll live to fight another day." Prince Alfwald, standing triumphant on his battle-scarred flagship with the captured standard of Sigurd the Red in his bloodied hands, watched the surviving Vikings limp away toward the northern horizon. The victory was his, but the cost had been higher than anyone anticipated, and he knew this was merely the first of many such encounters. The fire on the horizon had become a funeral pyre for the Age of Innocence, consuming both Viking and Saxon in its flames. The monastery raids that had begun as simple piracy were evolving into something far more significant, a clash of civilizations that would reshape the map of medieval Europe. As the survivors on both sides tended their wounds and counted their dead, one truth became crystal clear. The Viking Age had begun in earnest, and neither Northumbrian determination nor North courage would be sufficient to prevent the long, bloody conflict that lay ahead. The sea itself seemed to mourn, its grey waters washing the debris of battle toward distant shores, where new generations would inherit the legacy of this day's violence. The storm had passed, but the horizon still burned. Brother Arid's quill froze mid-stroke as the distant sound of splintering wood echoed across Lindisfarne's morning mist. The illuminated manuscript of St. Matthew lay forgotten beneath his trembling hands as he peered through the narrow window of the scriptorium. What he saw made his blood run cold. Sleek wooden serpents cutting through the grey waters, their carved dragon heads emerging from the dawn fog like demons from the depths of hell itself. The year was 793. And the holy island of Lindisfarne had known nothing but peace for generations. The monastery of St. Cuthbert stood as a beacon of learning and faith, its stone walls housing treasures that kings would envy: golden chalices, jeweled crosses, and manuscripts worth more than entire kingdoms. But on this June morning, that peace was about to be shattered forever. Einar Bloodaxe stood at the prow of his longship, the Raven's Wing, his weathered hands gripping the carved dragon head. As his pale blue eyes surveyed their target, behind him, 30 battle-hardened warriors from the fjords of Norway checked their weapons one final time. Their round shields bore the marks of countless raids. Their axes thirsted for Saxon blood, and their hearts burned with the promise of gold and glory. "Look upon it, brothers," Einar growled, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had sailed every sea from the frozen wastes of Iceland to the warm shores of Francia. "The Christ followers have grown fat and lazy on their prayers. Their God will not save them from the storm we bring." The sound of the monastery bell began its frantic tolling, echoing across the tidal flats as monks scattered like startled birds. But it was too late. The Vikings had chosen their moment perfectly dawn, when the mist provided cover and the tide allowed their shallow-drafted vessels to glide silently through waters that would trap heavier Saxon ships, as recorded by contemporary chroniclers whose accounts survive in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. The attack on Lindisfarne would mark the beginning of what historians now call the Viking Age, though the raiders themselves knew only that they sought riches and revenge against the spreading influence of Christianity in their ancestral lands. Prior Higbald emerged from the great stone church, his face pale with terror as he watched the approaching long. At 62 years old, he had devoted his life to serving God in this remote sanctuary, never imagining that war would find him on this isolated island. The prior clutched his wooden cross tightly, offering desperate prayers as the sound of war cries grew louder across the water. He shouted to young brother Wulfstan, "May God preserve us all." But the mainland seemed impossibly far away as the first Viking longship ground against the sandy shore with a sound like grinding bones. Einar leaped into the shallow water, his bearded face split by a savage grin as he raised his double-bladed axe toward the gray sky. "Odin's ravens feast today," he roared, and his warriors echoed the cry, their voices carrying across the island like thunder. The monks had perhaps moments before the storm broke upon them. Some fled toward the interior of the island, their brown robes flapping like the wings of frightened birds. Others stood frozen in prayer, their faith warring with their terror as they watched the Northmen surge up the beach like a tide of death. Young brother Alred pressed himself against the cold stone wall of the scriptorium, his heart hammering against his ribs as he listened to the approaching footsteps. Through the narrow window, he could see flames beginning to lick at the wooden outbuildings as the Vikings spread through the monastery complex like wolves through a flock of sheep. The fire on the horizon had become a conflagration that would consume everything in its path, and Lindisfarne, the holy island that had stood as a bastion of Christian learning for over a century, was about to become the first casualty in a war that would reshape the face of England forever. The great oak doors of St. Cuthbert's Church exploded inward with a thunderous crash that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Einar Bloodaxe stepped through the splintered remains, his axe dripping with the blood of brother Godwin, who had tried vainly to bar their entry. Behind him came his Wulfstavald, the Skull Splitter, Bjorn, Iron Fist, and 28 other warriors whose names would be cursed in Saxon prayers for generations to come. The interior of the church blazed with golden light reflected from countless treasures. Candlesticks wrought of pure silver stood beside the altar, while the great cross of St. Cuthbert encrusted with rubies and emeralds dominated the sacred space. But it was not merely the wealth that made the Vikings pause in wonder. It was the sheer audacity of it all. Here was enough gold to ransom kingdoms, left unguarded by men who believed their God would protect them. "By Thor's hammer," whispered Bjorn, his scarred face slack with amazement. "The Christ followers speak truly when they say their God provides." Prior Higbald stepped forward from behind the altar, his aged hands shaking but his voice steady with the courage of his convictions. "You defile sacred ground, heathen. Leave this place, and perhaps your souls might yet find redemption." Einar's laughter echoed through the stone halls like the howl of a winter wind. "Redemption? Old man, your God sleeps while mine feasts on the courage of warriors. Where is your Christ now?" The prior's response came in the form of a prayer spoken in Latin, his words rising toward the vaulted ceiling as if seeking to reach heaven itself. But heaven seemed very far away as Thorvald's sword found the old man's heart, silencing his prayers forever. What followed would be remembered as one of the darkest days in the history of Christian England. The Vikings moved through the monastery like a plague, their axes and swords cutting down any who dared resist. Brother Wulfstan, barely 18 years old, fell defending the library where he had spent countless hours copying sacred texts. Brother Edmund, keeper of the monastery's treasures, died with his keys still clutched in his hands, refusing to reveal the location of the hidden relic. But not all perished in the slaughter. Einar was a practical man, and practical men knew the value of slaves. A dozen younger monks were bound with rope and herded toward the beach, their tear-stained faces marking them as future merchandise in the slave markets of Dublin and York. Among them was Brother Al, who had been discovered cowering in the scriptorium, his illuminated manuscript still clutched to his chest like a shield that had failed him. As chronicled in the Annal Regni Francorum, which recorded the shock waves of this attack throughout Christian Europe, the systematic looting of Lindisfarne represented more than mere piracy. It was a calculated assault on the very heart of Northumbrian power and prestige. The Vikings worked with the efficiency of men who had perfected their craft through years of raiding. They stripped the altar of its golden ornaments, pried the jewels from crosses and chalices, and rolled the great tapestries into bundles that could be easily carried. The library, that repository of learning that had taken decades to assemble, became fuel for their fires as parchments and books were used to kindle flames that would consume the wooden buildings of the monastery complex. By midday, smoke rose from a dozen different fires across the Holy Island. The Vikings had found the monastery's stores of wine and ale, and some of the younger warriors were already deep in their cups. Their victory chants mixing with the crackling of flames and the distant cries of seabirds disturbed from their nesting grounds. Einar stood atop the monastery's highest tower, gazing out across the grey waters toward the Northumbrian mainland. Smoke signals were already rising from the beacon towers along the coast, carrying word of the attack to every settlement within a day's ride. Soon, King Ethelred would know that his realm had been violated, that the sanctity of Christian England had been broken by northern wolves, who feared neither God nor man. The fire on the horizon was spreading, and this was only the beginning. The great hall of Bamburgh Castle trembled with royal fury as King Ethelred, the first of Northumbria, received word of the atrocity at Lit. The messenger, a young thane named Oswulf, knelt before the throne with mud-stained clothes and eyes wide with horror. Having ridden his horse to death in his haste to bring the terrible news,